In this lecture, we look ahead at what types of energy transitions will be needed in the future by understanding what great energy transitions happened in the past. And first of all, we'll be dealing with CO2 emissions and climate change in a later lecture, but this gives you the scale of what the past energy-related CO2 emissions were. Their growth, they're reflecting fossil fuel growth in the 19th and 20th centuries, where we are right now, peaking annual CO2 emissions, and where they really need to go to meet our various climate change goals. Here, this red path here is a 50% chance of limiting pre-industrial temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. If we take this orange path here, it gives us a greater likelihood of meeting that temperature target. Some more ambitious temperature target is a 1.5 degree increase on pre-industrial temperatures. This blue here gives us a 50% chance of meeting that, and the green there gives us a greater likelihood, a 66% chance of meeting that. But whichever path you want to choose, this is very stark. I think everybody would agree. Even under the least ambitious of these, 50-50 chance of limiting temperatures to 2 degrees, we need to have all CO2 emissions eliminated by about 2080. In the more ambitious scenarios, we really should be removing all CO2 emissions from fossil fuels by the mid-century. So we're talking about ending our dependence on fossil fuels, or our dependence on unmitigated fossil fuels as quickly as they have risen. And I want to show you this because, there's a lot of optimism about the clean energy transitions, and rightly so. There's some incredible things happening. I'm going to remove my glasses so you don't see the reflection. These are, as of 2019, a list of countries with targets for net zero emissions. Here you can see some countries have already achieved net zero emissions, or they're on track for 2030. And then the list of countries discussing or having proposed legislation for meeting net zero target, which includes Ireland, by the way, and look out in the news in the next few weeks for the new climate change bill, which will hopefully bring this into law, is a target that will remove all emissions by the mid-century. That's great. But what would that take? So this is a paper that would be a famous paper by Mark Jacobson in Stanford University, and this will be the topic of one of the debates, what we'll call the 100% renewable electricity debate, on how to power all of the world on wind, water, and solar technologies. And what that would require is about 11.5 terawatts of energy, and that's the sun gives us an order of magnitude more energy than that every year. So what's the problem with that? The problem is that to get this 11.5 terawatts, and if you don't know what a terawatt is, I will cover that in a lecture soon. It requires about 500,000 tidal turbines, of which less than 1% are in place. 5,000 geothermal plants, around 2% of that are in place at the moment. Hydroelectric plants are a fairly well-established technology. Would require about 30% more of those. About 4 million wind turbines, even though the technology is maturing rapidly. Only 1% of those required wind turbines are in place. Developing an offshore industry, not least, is important. And then less than 1% of the required 700,000 wave converters, billion rooftop solar PV panels, 50,000 concentrated solar power plants, and 40,000 PV plants. So very little of that infrastructure which is needed is actually in place. So let's look back a bit at the global energy mix in history. So most people think actually that the world's energy consumption during the 19th century, which started here, was an era of coal, and indeed there was rapid industrialization, and that industrial process was dominated by coal. But if you look at the energy mix between 1800 and 1900, that was predominantly still biomass. So that's one factor. So the story about this is that energy transitions have taken a long time in the past, and we should be wary of that when we're speaking about the future. Another thing to note from this graph here is that the global energy mix has almost not changed, in terms of share at least, since the 1980s. So we have consistently around 80% of our energy is served by fossil fuels. Now the absolute amount of that has been growing very strongly, but and to a certain extent, in the last number of years, this stops at 2015, natural gas here, the lighter one, has been growing faster and has been supplanting coal as a power generating source in many countries, which has caused a lowering of emissions, which is great. And you can see here small wedges of what we call modern renewables, wind and solar electricity, modern biofuels, supplanting these traditional biofuels, which, remember, might be renewable, but they're not sustainable. They're people chopping down trees to make fires for cooking. So of this carbon-free part in the early 21st century, modern renewables and nuclear have only slowly been displacing traditional biomass. It's still a very large part, actually, of our energy consumption. So we want to use this to look ahead at the feasibility of major energy transitions which are required to meet these net zero targets. So our earliest energy systems were based around biomass and fuels. So human ancestors of ours, we were the first animals to deliberately extract energy we mastered control of fire around 800,000 years ago. That was the key to our success as a species, I suppose. There was just a small number of sources of that, largely biomass. Here there's a simple wood fire. There's also dung, animal dung, which was used, crop residues as well when we became agricultural societies. And then, of course, animal and muscle power. So we domesticated animals, and the power that we got from animals, which ultimately came from biomass from the sun, from their feed, was the main source of power. So these were very inefficient conversions. They were used just for subsistence. People's quality of life didn't improve substantially over this period. People were just living from hand to mouth. I suppose the first industrial process which revolutionized our energy system was still based on biomass. This is the industrial use of wood for industry, for iron and glass and shipbuilding. And also the smelting of iron ores. And this required very large amounts of charcoal, and that was produced by the burning of woodlands of coppiced wood. And so this invention of the blast furnace to produce charcoal coming from wood caused mass deforestation in many parts of the world, including in Ireland. So Ireland was deforested largely for iron and shipbuilding industries for the 1800s. So even up until the 19th century, which had a strong rise in industrial machines, the 19th century was not run on coal. It was run on wood, charcoal, crop residues, and that provided around 85% of all energy worldwide up until the 19th century. The first major energy transition away from biomass was to coal. So coal is more energy dense. It produces actually less smoke than biomass and dung. So it was preferred for industry and for heating homes for a number of reasons. That energy density is one factor. Another factor is that biomass, as countries became deforested, as wood became scarce, coal became more economical because it was more easy to transport. It was a higher energy density than biomass. Another factor is that coal has higher combustion temperatures, so it's more energy dense. In a small space, you can store a larger amount of heat energy in one small space. So this allowed the development of cities, which was essential for industrialization, that rapid urbanization. It also enabled new types of technology, enabled metalworking. So coal use enabled the rise of steel, and that enabled better tools. the use of coal had major impacts on our social development as well as economies. The use of coal for heating homes changed the layout and the building style of homes even, but it also led to very big problems. Here's, for example, a picture of London. Even in the 1950s, there was huge smoke that killed thousands of people every year because of the smog that this produced. This smog actually shut down London for a couple of days or weeks, called the Great Smog of London. That was in the 20th century. Also, one of the biggest factors which encouraged the use of coal was and actually was also dependent on the exploitation of coal, was the invention of the steam engine and the improvement of the steam engine. So actually, the steam engine was first developed and produced to pump water out of deeper coal mines. Because as they extracted coal from the shallower areas, water got into the deeper coal mines, and they needed some pumps to pump out that water. So the steam engines allowed for the first time converting heat into motion, heat into that extraction of water. And so this kind of coal and industrialization and innovation created this kind of virtuous cycle, this loop of energy exploitation and innovation that really changed the course of civilization. However, just like in the 20th century, just like in the 19th century, it was still run by biomass. A lot of people think that the 20th century was run on oil, that, oil is the major energy source of the 20th century. But the 20th century was really run on coal as well. So bituminous and lignite coals reached the highest share of global fuel consumption at about 55% in the 1910s. And crude oil use didn't actually surpass coal until the 1960s globally. So the 20th century has seen the second major energy transition from coal to oil and gas. And again, coal has many downsides, and the discovery of and exploitation of oil and gas gave many benefits. And the major thing there is the major technology that allowed that was the internal combustion engine fueled by oil here. So oil and gas, they're lighter and more efficient. They're suitable for automobiles. Coal-fired cars never really took off. And also take what components come from different forms of energy, not just oil. So the steel that's made from using coal, the tires, the rubber in the tires come from petroleum made in factories that use electricity. So this exploitation of modern energy changed where and how we live profoundly, because, as you know, the affordability of private cars has completely changed where we can live and how we can live. This chart gives us a sense of the speed of these different energy transitions. So this chart starts for every fuel: coal, oil, natural gas, and modern renewables. It starts at the year when that fuel reached 5% of the global energy mix. And you saw for coal, it reached 5% of the global energy mix only in the 1840s, and that slowly reached 50% of the energy mix 60 years after that. So 1900, coal was around half of the global energy mix, replacing biomass. Oil only came to 5% of the global energy mix then in 1915, and it took another 60 years to reach 40%. So oil hasn't actually reached 50% yet, so it takes 60 years for this transition to oil. Gas is only around 25% of global energy demand, and that started in 1930 at 5% of the global energy mix. Modern renewables then, wind, solar, and hydro, are still less than 5% of the global energy mix. As of this chart is a little bit out of date. So if we want to replace all of our coal, oil, and natural gas in 20 years, 30 years, you're talking about a transition like this, much faster than we have seen in any previous energy transition before. one of the major factors behind different global energy transitions, I've mentioned this before, is power density, the amount of power in a square meter of the land. And this is a concept I've used a lot of concepts from Václav Smil, who's a very prominent thinker in this energy transition space. I will link to a few of his articles at the end of this lecture. Highly recommended. And power density means the watts per square meter. So you can see here renewables are in green, and they have many benefits, but they are not energy dense. So they need a vast amount of more space to create the same amount of power. So a move to renewables could vastly increase the footprint, literally the land area footprint of the world's energy production, unless we move to nuclear power, which is far more energy dense than this. So those three key factors, to reiterate, that drove these major energy transitions to fossil fuels. First of all, declining resource availability, moving away from biomass, basically deforestation. The second is when there is a higher quality fuel available, which means higher energy density, more power dense fuels available, which lead to easier storage and greater flexibility. For example, in the case of oil, and lower cost of fossil fuels when technology enables their extraction quickly. So each transition was caused by a profound shift in society, in industry, transport, and homes. And on these 3 points, at least, these 3 points which motivated the historical energy transitions, none of these cause an urgent acceleration away from fossil fuels at the moment. There are still abundant fossil fuels. There's no resource availability scarcity. There's no scarcity of fossil fuels. There's plenty being found and being developed. Enough peak oil is not a concern anymore. Fossil fuels are very high quality. They're very energy dense. They're easy to store. We have a huge amount of infrastructure for their transport, and they're relatively low cost compared with energy sources. So one quote is that the Stone Age didn't end for the lack of stones, but the oil age will need to end long before the world runs out of oil, and this points to the major challenge again. Some countries specifically have made some very rapid transitions. Here's 3 examples. The Netherlands switched very rapidly from coal to natural gas in a decade. Japan switched to crude oil from 6% to 72% in 2 decades. And Denmark's wind-powered electricity generation went from 12% in 2000 to 41% in 2014. And I'd expect actually Ireland's transition to wind power would follow that share. There are some specific, very rapid energy transitions towards, but they are typically take 40 to 60 years for one of these sources to become dominant. So here is a list of 7 reasons why it will be very challenging to end fossil fuels. This list comes from an article from Václav Smil again, and I'd highly recommend that. The main kind of gist is that we're still over 80% fueled by fossil fuels. We need to measure progress on a global scale, not just on a national scale, because CO2 emissions, once they're emitted, go to the global atmosphere. And primary energy supply is still overwhelmingly fossil fueled. And non-fossil fuel energy supply is dominated by nuclear, hydro, and I should say biomass as well. Václav Smil is very pessimistic about the evidence of the global energy transition. Some people would argue that wind and solar in the last couple of years have accelerated so rapidly that this is no longer the case, and we'll look at that in more detail later, and you'll participate in a debate about that. But even in some very ambitious countries, for example, Germany has led the energy transition with its Energiewende. It was 84% fossil fueled in 2000, and it's still 79% fossil fueled in 2015. This is actually mainly because following the Fukushima disaster and the nuclear meltdown there, Germany committed to phasing out nuclear generation. So despite a huge bounds in wind and solar generation, there was an increase in coal. And thirdly, any shift that's happened so far has mainly been on electricity. So electricity is a small part of our energy system, as we'll have seen. Transport and heat actually make up a much greater share of the final energy that we need and use. And all of the excitement so far has been really about renewable electricity rather than renewable heat and transport. Fourth there is that so far we have relatively low shares of wind and solar, and they're intermittent. They require either fossil fuel or battery backup. And so far, even though there are very strong targets and institutional capacities to meet those high shares of wind and solar needed to reach high shares of renewable energy, we haven't cracked that nut of intermittency fully yet. 5 there, replacing liquid oil in transportation will be even more challenging than electricity. One example I have is from America. There was a big push to produce ethanol there. Ethanol is an important crop, is produced from an important crop from corn which usually goes to food. So after diverting 40% of its most important crop, which is corn, to produce ethanol, this only supplanted 10% of US transport fuel consumption. So even with a huge shift in food production, it only gave 10% of the US's gasoline consumption. 6 there, even if we crack the transport nut, industry and other very hard to decarbonize sectors still remain. How are we going to make iron, cement, plastics, and indeed how we're going to fuel aviation and shipping? That being said, the first hydrogen fueled plane was in the news today. That hydrogen can be made from renewables. But number 7 is the sheer amount of money that has gone into global fossil fuel infrastructure. Around $25 trillion has been created spending this global fossil fuel industry, and even the committed emissions from the existing and proposed energy infrastructure would be more than enough to breach our 1.5 degree limit, I'm afraid. So in summary, the 5 greatest challenges for large-scale energy transitions: scale of the shift, the energy density, power density, intermittency, and geographical distribution. And here's a link there with some sobering thoughts. I hope this hasn't been too pessimistic. The rest of the module will be motivating you to make that shift happen, because there's so much political and kind of societal will behind this shift.